You can feel it, can't you? That invisible tug in the air, the unanswered question hanging between the silences. She doesn't say it, she won't. But every pause, every glance, every just checking in, from mutual friends, it's there. The truth is, silence isn't always indifference. Sometimes, it's restraint. Sometimes it's a battlefield of pride and vulnerability. She hasn't reached out. Not because she doesn't think about it, but because she's locked in a quiet war between hope and self-respect. And that hope, it's you. She checks her phone more often than she admits. She rewrites the message in her head a dozen times. But nothing gets sent. Not because she doesn't want to, but because she doesn't know if you are worth that first move anymore. See, people don't forget connection. Not the real kind. Not the kind that shook their soul at 2 a.m. and made them feel seen when the world was too loud. She hasn't forgotten. But memory alone doesn't rebuild bridges. It takes courage. It takes clarity. It takes honesty about what you truly want and why. You might think she's moved on. That she's thriving without you. That your silence has become her peace. But still, there are moments, rare and raw, when her breath catches at the sound of your name, when a song plays or a scent passes, and suddenly, you're there. Uninvited, unspoken, unshaken, and you wonder, does she hope I'll reach out again? The real question isn't if she's hoping. It's why you haven't. It's what you're waiting for. Permission. A sign. Sometimes the sign is the silence. Sometimes the sign is the fact that it still matters. You don't need a green light to speak your truth. You don't need certainty to step forward. You only need one thing: the strength to act in alignment with your heart, not your fear. Because regret doesn't come from trying. It comes from the things we leave unsaid. The messages we draft and delete. The love we bury under ego and hesitation. So stop asking if she's hoping. Start asking what you're going to do about it. This isn't about playing it safe. This is about stepping into the arena with your truth fully loaded. No masks, no games, no waiting. Be bold, be clear. Be someone who doesn't need permission to show up for what matters. You have the power to shift the story. So the next move, make it count. Speak, act, own it. Because if you don't, someone else will. Silence can be louder than words. It's easy to assume that when someone doesn't reach out, they've stopped caring. But the truth is far more complex. Silence isn't always a sign of apathy. Sometimes it's self-preservation. Sometimes it's a wall built to keep emotions in, not people out. People often fall into the habit of assuming that if they're not being spoken to, they've been forgotten. That if a message isn't received, then it was never considered. But silence can be a battlefield of emotion, where every unsent word is a decision, and every day without contact is a quiet struggle with vulnerability. There's a certain power in silence, a form of emotional restraint that can mask the turmoil underneath. Just because someone doesn't reach out doesn't mean they don't feel the urge to. That moment they pick up the phone, open the chat, type a message, only to delete it before it's ever seen. That's not indifference. That's fear, confusion, pride, and longing colliding in a single breath. And it happens more often than we realize. Silence, in that case, is not absence of thought, but the result of too many of them. People assume that detachment is clean and final. But for many, silence is filled with noise. It's the playlist that reminds them of you. It's the memory triggered by a scent or a place. It's the accidental glance at the time when you used to call. Every moment of quiet could be filled with thoughts they've chosen not to share. Not because they don't matter, but because they matter too much. It's easier to stay silent than to risk rejection. It's safer to remain distant than to seem desperate. Silence can be a test, a way to gauge how much you're willing to fight for something. It's an invitation in disguise, not always to come back, but to reflect, to step forward with intention rather than impulse. When someone stops speaking, it doesn't always mean they want to end the story. Sometimes, they're waiting to see if you'll pick up the pen. Sometimes they're holding space, wondering if you'll care enough to cross the distance. It's tempting to equate stillness with closure, to believe that because someone has gone quiet, the connection has died. But silence can mean there are words too heavy to say. There are emotions too tangled to unravel quickly. Sometimes, people retreat into silence because it's the only place where they feel safe to process what they can't express out loud. That silence holds grief, confusion, love, and memory, all wrapped into one invisible weight. When silence falls, assumptions rise. People create stories to make sense of it. She's over it. She's fine. She doesn't care. But rarely do we ask what that silence is protecting. Sometimes it's dignity. Sometimes it's heartbreak. And other times it's the last thread of self, worth they're trying to hold on to without begging to be seen. We often forget that it takes immense strength to say nothing when everything in you wants to scream. The absence of words doesn't mean the absence of feeling. It just means that the space is too charged for casual conversation. When people go silent, they're often overwhelmed by everything they can't fit into a single message. They don't want to speak until they're sure it's safe. Until they're sure they won't be misunderstood, dismissed, or judged for still caring. Their silence is not empty, it's full of unsaid truths. Silence also becomes a boundary. A line drawn not out of hatred but self-protection. To not reach out isn't always a tactic. It's a defense. It's a decision to choose peace over vulnerability, even if that peace is shaky and temporary. We don't always realize how much courage it takes for someone to hold their tongue, to hold back the impulse to reconnect. Especially when they still feel everything they're trying to forget. Some people wait in silence, because it's the only way they know how to love without losing themselves again. Because reaching out might feel like giving up the last bit of pride they've been able to rebuild. So they stay quiet. Not because they don't wonder if you still think about them, but because they're afraid of what the answer might be. They'd rather imagine that maybe you still care, than confirm that you don't. And so, silence lingers, not as a punishment but as a placeholder. A way to keep the door slightly ajar without swinging it wide open. A way to cope, a way to survive. And in that silence lives the possibility that the story isn't over. Just paused. Waiting for the right moment, the right words, or maybe just the right reason to be heard again. A real connection doesn't fade just because time passes or conversations stop. When someone has impacted your life on a deep, emotional level, they leave fingerprints on your thoughts, your routines, your quiet moments. That connection doesn't require constant communication to stay alive. It lingers in the way you remember their laugh. The way your favorite places feel a little different now. The way certain words or songs pull you back to something once shared. A real connection becomes part of your emotional blueprint whether you want it to or not. You may go days, weeks, even months without thinking about it. And then suddenly it hits. Out of nowhere, a memory, a feeling, a small detail you hadn't noticed in a while resurfaces. That's the mark of genuine connection. It doesn't demand attention, but it never really disappears. Even when you convince yourself you've moved on, some part of you still reacts to the idea of them. It's not about holding on. It's about how deeply they've been woven into your personal story. Connections don't depend on perfection. They're not sustained solely by how easy or smooth things were. In fact, the most lasting bonds often come from the shared moments of struggle, honesty, and vulnerability. The conversations where you felt completely seen. The arguments that showed you cared enough to fight. The silences that still carried presence. These become markers in your emotional landscape, things you return to, even if only in your thoughts. You carry parts of that person with you, long after they're gone. Maybe it's a lesson they taught you. Maybe it's a version of yourself you only ever saw when you were with them. You grow from the connection, but you're also shaped by it. It leaves you different. Not in a dramatic, life-altering way, but in the subtle shifts of how you see the world, what you value, what you miss. Sometimes the connection shows up when you least expect it. You meet someone new and for a split second you compare them. Not because you're stuck in the past, but because the past redefined your standards. You realize the depth of what you had when you try to find it again. And that's the quiet legacy of real connection. It becomes your reference point, even if it's unspoken. You may not talk about them anymore. You may have deleted photos, erased texts, put away reminders. But the memory still breathes beneath the surface. Not in a haunting way, in a way that reminds you what mattered. And sometimes, just knowing that something mattered is enough to keep it alive inside you, long after the moment has passed. Even when people grow apart, the emotional impact doesn't vanish. You might find yourself wondering how they are, if they ever think about you, if they still remember the things that meant so much. It's not about wanting them back. It's about recognizing that something real existed. That recognition alone has weight. It validates your experience, your feelings, your growth. You may outgrow the relationship, but not the connection. The two aren't the same. One can fade while the other stays intact. Connections live in our memory in a way that facts never do. They're felt, not just remembered. That's why closure rarely comes from answers. It comes from accepting that some bonds don't unravel. They simply stop being acted upon. You could be surrounded by people and still think about them. You could be happy, content, thriving, and still have flashes of something that once felt essential. This isn't a flaw. It's a testament to the depth of what you experienced. Connections don't make you weak. They show that you were open, present, and human enough to care deeply. There will always be reminders, quiet and unexpected, and every time they appear, it's not a sign that you're stuck. It's a reflection of the truth. Some people leave a mark not because they stayed, but because when they were there, they truly mattered. Waiting can feel like control. Like you're doing something by doing nothing. Like holding your breath somehow protects your heart from breaking. You convince yourself that the universe will hand you a perfectly timed sign. A signal that it's safe, that it's the right moment, that everything will go your way. But signs don't come gift-wrapped. They come disguised as gut feelings, sleepless nights, repeated thoughts that won't let go. The problem isn't that there are no signs. It's that most people ignore the ones that already exist. You keep telling yourself you'll act when the timing is better, when you're more certain, when they show some hint that it's okay to reach out. You want proof before vulnerability. You want reassurance before courage. But that's not how life works. Sometimes, the only thing standing between you and what you want is the idea that there's still time. That if you wait long enough, the perfect moment will appear and everything will align without risk. The truth is, most people don't miss their chance because of lack of opportunity. They miss it because of hesitation. They overthink. They analyze every possibility until action becomes paralyzing. They play out every worst-case scenario in their minds, hoping that the fear will make them more prepared, more ready. But all it does is steal time. All it does is let life pass by under the illusion of being cautious. There's a cost to waiting. Every day you hold back, you lose the chance to make a different choice. The idea that clarity will arrive wrapped in certainty is a myth. Clarity comes from action, from doing, from choosing. Not from sitting still and hoping that your fears will one day turn into confidence. Confidence is a muscle you build by using it, not by wishing for it. The longer you wait, the louder the doubts become. The more time you spend trying to calculate the perfect outcome, the more distant the opportunity becomes. That distance doesn't just separate you from what you want. It changes you. It makes you more hesitant, more careful, more unsure of your own instincts. You start to lose touch with your own desire, because you've trained yourself to prioritize logic over intuition. The people who make the biggest changes in their lives aren't the ones who wait for signs. They're the ones who trust themselves enough to move even when the path isn't lit. They step forward even when their hands are shaking. They speak up even when they know it might not be received the way they hope. Because they've learned that truth without action is just noise, and fear without movement becomes regret. You already know what you feel. You already know what you want. The delay isn't coming from confusion. It's coming from fear of not getting the outcome you crave. But outcomes aren't guaranteed. They never were. What is guaranteed is that silence will not bring resolution. Inaction will not deliver closure. Waiting will not build bridges. Only action will. It's easier to tell yourself, not now, than to face the possibility of rejection. But not now often turns into never. And that slow erosion of intention becomes something heavier over time. You start to wonder not just what would have happened if you'd reached out, but who you could have become if you had the courage to try. The loss isn't always them. Sometimes, the real loss is the version of yourself that stayed quiet. You can't keep outsourcing your choices to timing. You can't keep waiting for someone else to move first, for something external to validate your next step. No one is going to live your life for you. No one else is going to carry the weight of your what ifs. That burden is yours. And the only way to lighten it is to act in alignment with your truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that feels. So many people live lives because they're waiting. Waiting to be sure. Waiting to be brave. Waiting for the sign they've already received 1,000 times in different forms. But the discomfort you feel, the pull you can't explain, the question that keeps repeating in your head, that is the sign, not perfect. Not easy, but real. And it's asking you to stop standing still. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet. It's that subtle shift in energy, when you decide you're no longer going to wait to be understood. When you choose to speak even if your voice shakes. Leading with courage means letting go of control, of how you'll be perceived, how they'll respond, whether it will all make sense in the end. It means choosing to show up, raw and unfiltered, knowing full well that you might not get the reaction you want. But you do it anyway because integrity matters more than comfort. Ego is the mask you wear when you're afraid of not being enough. It's the part of you that wants to win, to be right, to appear unbothered, untouchable. Ego will convince you to stay silent, to withdraw, to pretend you don't care. Also, you don't risk being exposed. But ego is fragile. It shatters under truth. It crumbles under authenticity. It's a shield that eventually becomes a prison. Courage, on the other hand, is expansive. It breathes life into stagnant situations and clears space for honesty to exist, even when it's messy. There's a difference between acting out of pride and acting out of strength. Pride wants to be seen as strong. Strength simply is. Courage means you are willing to be misunderstood, willing to be rejected, willing to face the discomfort of truth, all because the alternative, a life built on pretenses, is far more painful. Ego will always whisper, "Don't let them see you vulnerable." Courage will say, "Let them see you, especially when you are." You can't connect deeply with anyone. Not truly. When you're more committed to protecting your image than expressing your truth. Ego builds walls and waits for others to knock them down. Courage opens doors and says, "Here I am." One hides to feel safe. The other shows up to be free. Every relationship, every moment of communication, is an invitation. Will you armor up or will you let them see what's real? Leading with courage is about choosing truth over tactics. It means saying what needs to be said even if it makes you sweat. It means risking the loss of your pride for the chance at clarity. It's texting first, apologizing first, forgiving first, because none of those acts make you weak. They make you human. They make you someone who chooses growth over games. And they draw the kind of people who are also tired of pretending. The most powerful people are not the ones who play it cool. They're the ones who lean into sincerity. They're the ones who can stand in their feelings without letting those feelings define them. Ego constantly demands to be right. Courage quietly asks what's real. When you act from ego, you push others away to protect your own sense of importance. When you act from courage, you bring people closer because you value connection over control. Courage also doesn't always look like a grand gesture. Sometimes it's just choosing not to match someone's silence. It's being the first to say, "This hurt me," or "I still care," or "I don't know where we stand, but I'd rather find out than keep guessing." That kind of vulnerability feels terrifying. And that's the point. You grow by stepping into what scares you, not by rehearsing safety in every conversation. Ego might get you validation, attention, even temporary power. But it will never give you peace. It will never give you intimacy. It will never give you the satisfaction of knowing you were honest about how you felt, what you wanted, and who you really were. Courage gives you that. Even when the outcome doesn't go your way, there's something deeply grounding about knowing you showed up without the need to manipulate or perform. You'll notice that most people avoid courage, not because they're heartless, but because they've been hurt. They believe ego protects them from that. But healing doesn't happen in hiding. Healing happens when you finally speak your truth, act from your heart, and let go of needing to look strong. The irony is that the moment you do that, you become stronger than you've ever been. Because you've stopped living for the approval of others, and started living in alignment with yourself. Courage clears the fog. It tells you who's real, who's ready, who's capable of meeting you where you are. It strips away the roles we play and brings us back to something raw and human. If ego keeps you locked in loops of waiting, wondering, and defending, courage breaks the loop and opens a new path. Not always easy, not always clean, but always honest. Regret is rarely born from what you said. It's born from the words you swallowed, the calls you didn't make, the messages you typed and deleted, the chances you talked yourself out of. It's easy to look back and think silence was the right move at the time. That playing it safe protected your heart. But in the long run, safety can become a cage. And what eats away at you isn't rejection. It's wondering what might have happened if you had just been braver. There's a cost to holding back. You don't feel it immediately, but it grows. It shows up in quiet moments when you're alone with your thoughts. When you remember a look, a moment, a conversation you could have started. It comes back in fragments, reminding you that you chose stillness over movement. And while logic will always find reasons to justify inaction, your heart remembers the opportunities you let slip away. And that memory stays longer than any fear ever did. Inaction is the illusion of control. It feels safe to wait, to pause, to not disturb the waters. You convince yourself that if you don't move, you can't mess it up. That if you stay silent, you won't say the wrong thing. But avoiding the wrong thing also means you never get the chance to say the right one. You protect yourself from failure, yes, but you also rob yourself of potential, of possibility, of growth. So many people hold their truth hostage, hoping someone else will unlock the door first. But waiting becomes its own prison. Time passes. Circumstances change. People move on not because the connection didn't matter, but because nothing was done to nurture it. You lose not because you weren't enough, but because you didn't allow yourself to be seen in time. And when you realize that, it cuts deeper than any rejection ever could. What we don't often talk about is how regret rewrites memory. Over time, it colors everything with, what if? What if I had tried? What if I had said something? What if I hadn't let my fear call the shots? The answers never come. And that's what haunts you. You're left to imagine 1,000 alternate endings, all based on a version of you who acted differently. A version of you who didn't let pride or fear lead the way. Action is uncomfortable. It exposes you, it requires humility. But it also offers closure, not the kind that depends on other people's responses, but the kind that comes from knowing you honored what you felt, that you showed up for your truth, that you gave it everything you had, even if it didn't lead to the outcome you hoped for. And that self-respect, that kind of peace is priceless. You don't get moments back. Once they pass, they don't wait around for you to be ready. And yes, there's grace in timing, but there's also danger in delay. When you keep waiting for the perfect moment, you forget that the moment you're in right now is the only one guaranteed. Action lives in the now. Regret lives in the past. And when you let the present pass you by, you're feeding the future with all the things you'll wish you had done differently. There's this belief that time will make hard decisions easier. But in reality, time makes inaction heavier. It adds weight to the silence. It stretches out the space between what you wanted to do and what you actually did, until eventually the gap becomes too wide to cross. And then you're left staring at the space where courage should have been, wondering how it slipped through your fingers. Regret doesn't always scream. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's the way you hesitate with new people, afraid of repeating old patterns. Sometimes it's the way you replay a moment from months ago as if it happened yesterday. Sometimes it's just a heaviness in your chest when you hear their name, a reminder that the only thing standing between then and now was a choice. One you didn't make. There's nothing noble about staying silent when you have something real to say. There's nothing strong about pretending not to care when your heart is still involved. The world doesn't reward indifference. It rewards bravery. Even if you don't get what you want, you'll gain something more valuable: integrity, alignment, self-trust. You'll know that you didn't let fear dictate your story, and that knowing will carry you through every version of yourself still waiting to be set free.